Okay. So find the fall of the House of Usher. And like I said, it's good to have the background information, the plot information before we start reading this together, just because this language is difficult. Edgar Allan Poe did it on purpose. He knew his audience was going to be sort of middle-class America that really didn't have access to a lot of these difficult words. And so he wanted to make his audience uncomfortable with the language. It's called cacophonous language, and it's that way for a reason. So even the diction, it makes us feel uncomfortable. One of the things that you have to remember is that Edgar Allan Poe's stories, and one of the reasons that he was so prolific in his writing, is that he gets paid by the word. Hang on one second. Thought this would work, but it's not working. So he would get paid for his short stories, and he had a lot of words in there so that he got paid more, okay? So when we talk about how much is written within this short story, again, that's kind of why I like you guys being able to see what happens in the short story before we actually get there. These short stories would come out in sections, and it was kind of like if you've ever seen a series, like a horror series, like American Horror Story or any of those other ones, that's kind of what this was. So people would be specifically looking for this short story because they found it interesting. And he was known for these sort of serial short stories that he would have. All right. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback, dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within the view of the melancholy house of Usher. Take a look at how long that sentence is. I mean, you're not even a foot into this story, and already you're being bombarded by all of this language. Okay? Essentially, we have this setting, and the time period is important. He's on the outskirts of a house. The house is on the outskirts of a village, and it's sitting above a swamp. When he keeps saying tarn, T-A-R-N, that's a swamp. Now, what is a swamp? Edgar Allan Poe, just like he was obsessed with caves and things like that, was also obsessed with swamps because it was a living, dead thing. Swamps are basically decaying bodies, and by decaying all of the things around them, they create life. So Edgar Allan Poe is obsessed with this idea of life after death and death involved with life. And the whole end of the story, you saw that the big scare was that they may or may not have accidentally buried Madeline Usher alive. That was a true fear during the time period. They actually set aside houses where they would put the dead people to sit for 3 or 4 days to make sure that they were truly dead, because the doctors weren't that great back then, and they couldn't really tell if someone was dead or alive. In fact, there was an entire funeral industry that was based off of the idea of accidentally burying someone alive. If you've ever heard the saying, "for whom the bell tolls," that bell was actually a little bell on top of a grave that if you were accidentally buried alive, you could ring the bell and someone would come and hopefully dig you out in time before you died. There are news stories where they have gone and unearthed bodies that have already been buried, and they found scratch marks on the inside of it. This was a real fear for the time period, okay? It's also a bit of a metaphor because it's also the existential crisis, right? It's the fear ultimately of what happens to us after we die. Like, is there any sort of like bodily or soul life? It's a big question. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of unsufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of the half-pleasurable, basic, because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape, features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant, eye-like windows, upon the few rank sedges, and upon the few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than the after dream of the reveler upon opium. That's another bit of obsession with Edgar Allan Poe, is the idea of opium, dreams, and absinthe. Have you ever heard of absinthe? Do you know what absinthe is? The green fairy. It was a drink at the time. I think it is now illegal in the United States, but it was a drink at the time. It was a mix of like opium, wormwood, liqueurs, sort of peppermint tasting, and people would actually get addicted to this particular drink, and it caused major hallucinations. And Poe loved it, drank it all the time. The bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. So he basically says, I'm standing there, I see this castle, that's the sort of house of my friend, And I'm like, oh God, this place is so creepy. Maybe if I look around and try to take in the big picture, it won't be so creepy. But as he looks at the big picture is like big white decaying trees and like swamplands and like the house itself is crumbling. He's like, well, that didn't make anything better. So he's saying it is gloomy, it is creepy, and even though I tried to shake the creep off, it was still creepy. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. So even as I looked at it, Ian was like, that is creepy. At no point in time was he was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, all right, I kind of like creepy. Let's go forward. Even that, he still felt a sense of dread. Okay? Then normally, again, this is sort of like when we go back to the idea of the horror movie trope. If you see something creepy, hopefully, you're going to look at it and be like, I'm good. I don't want to do that. All right? But instead, our protagonist has to move forward. The house of Usher is a twofold meaning. If I say your house, I mean not only the physical building in which you reside, I also mean your family name. Okay, so remember way back in the day we had English houses or Scottish houses or Irish houses and they had a coat of arms? That is also what the house of Usher is. And the fact that the building itself has a giant crack down the middle is a metaphor for the family itself. Now, hopefully you gleaned a little bit off of the movie that we saw, but there is something very, very untoward about the relationship between Roderick Usher and his sister. What was it, I paused to think, what was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? So again, that's a metaphor, not only of the building itself, but also of the family. It was a mystery, all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back on the unsatisfactory conclusion that while beyond doubt there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among the considerations beyond our depth, meaning that I figured out that it was just one of those things. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify or perhaps annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression. And, acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down. But, with a shudder, even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant eye-like windows. So again, he's like, God, that's creepy. Maybe if I look at it differently. So he takes his horse and he drives his horse to the top of a little precipice and he looks down into the blackened swamp water. And the blackened swamp water makes he's like, maybe it's better if I look in the mirror. Oh crap, that's not better, that makes it worse, okay? And again, the fact that the house of Usher is compared to a skull, vacant eye-like holes, gaping mouth, all of those things are supposed to be metaphorical, meaning that the fall of the house of Usher is metaphorically not only the house that goes into the swamp, but also the family name, okay? Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now propose to myself a sojourn of some weeks. So basically, I have to live here for a few weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood. So when I was younger, he was one of my best friends. But many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, which in its wildly inopportune nature had admitted no other than a personal reply, meaning that he sounded like he was going crazy, so I had to reply to him personally. Okay, so my best friend of childhood sounds like he's going crazy. I got to go reply to him. And remember, it's not like our time where we can just like text and be like, yo, bro, you okay? How you doing, fam? So instead, he has to go and actually visit him. The MS gave evidence of a nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this and much more was said. It was the apparent heart that went with his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith what I still considered a very singular summons. So basically, I had to go. I could feel how upset he was. I had to go. Although as boys we had an even intimate associate, yet I really knew little of my friend. His reserve had always been excessive. Even as a kid, when we were friends, he was young and kind of creepy and quiet. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted, time out of mind, for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself through long ages and many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeated deeds of munificent yet unobtrusive charity, as well as a passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more than to the orthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. So basically, not only was he a weird kid, his whole family was known to be weird. They were so weird, in fact, that they were very well known to be purveyors of art, meaning that they were like cool artsy people. But lately, they had been working on the idea of musical science. By the way, this movement of musical science was a brand new thing at the time period and very interesting. So basically what they tried to do was to study the psychological effects of music and how it changed people overall, because that seemed to be a very, like, remember the time period, they're talking about like, well, God is the most important thing and all music should be about God, and like we should always, you know, everything that we should do should be about God. And then along comes this music just for music's sake. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? Can it help people? Can it hurt people? Will it make them sin more? Will it make them sin less? Like, how do we deal with this? So his family, as in the Roderick Usher family, lately had been very interested in this new weird thing, but they've always been very weird. I had learned, too, that the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. We'll let that sink in for a second. Let me reread that so that you may understand. All time honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variation, so lain. If a family tree doesn't have a lot of branches, what does that mean? It means exactly what you think it means. Yes, that look of disgust. Remember, this is supposed to make us uncomfortable. So essentially, the relationship between Roderick and Madeline Usher is an uncomfortable one for a reason. And apparently, this type of relationship has been happening in the family for a very long time. Okay? It was this deficiency I considered, meaning that it was the incest, I think, while running over in through the thought of perfect keeping of the character of the premises and the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which the one, in a long lapse of centuries, might have exercised upon the other. It was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue and the consequent undeviating transmission, oh dear, from sire to son of the patrimony with the name which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate and the quaint, equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include in the minds of the peasantry who used it both the family and the family mansion. So essentially, Edgar Allan Poe has tied together the idea of the House of Arms of Usher as well as the house itself as Usher. So he is saying, hey, reader, the metaphor is the house. The house has a giant crack going through it. The house gets eaten up by the barn or the swamp. That is a metaphor for the house itself. I have said that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down within the tarn, had been to deepen the first singular impression. There can be no doubt of that consciousness of the rapid increase of my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself, meaning that I definitely creeped myself out. Such I had long known the paradoxical law of the sentiments having terror as a basis. And it might have been this reason only that when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself from its image in the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy. A fancy so ridiculous indeed that I but mention it to show the vivid force of the sensations which oppressed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as to really believe that about the whole mansion and domain, so here there an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees and the gray wall and the silent tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden hued. So I'm looking at the house and I creep myself out, and then I convince myself that there is a big, yucky cloud surrounding the house. Shaking off from my spirit what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed to be that of an excessive antiquity. The discoloration of the ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in fine, tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all of this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of the parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In this, there was much that reminded me of the specious totality of the old woodwork, which had rotted for long years in some neglected vault with no disturbance from the breath of the external air. Beyond the indication of extensive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which extending from the roof of the front made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. So essentially, have you guys ever seen wood that's been eaten by termites? Have you guys ever seen what that looks like? Or like seen it in the woods maybe? The outside of the wood looks fine. But then when you get closer, you're able to see these tiny little holes, and you realize that if you like pushed your finger through it, the whole thing would crumble. That's what he's describing when he's talking about the House of Usher. The House of Usher from the outside looks as though it's being held together, but as soon as you get close to it, then you realize all of the tiny perceptible holes and a giant crack down the middle that indicates that it's just about to fall apart. That's a metaphor for the family. The House of Usher itself, because it has all of this money, and because it's got this great big house, the House of Usher itself looks as though it's fine from the outside. But the minute you get close to it, you realize that it's seconds from falling apart. Noticing these things, I rode over the short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet, stealthy step, thence conducted me in silence through many a dark and intricate passages in my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I had already spoken. While the objects around me, while the carvings of the ceilings, the somber tapestries of the walls, the ebon blackness of the floors, and a phantasmagoric armorial trophy. So phantasmagoric just means that it's like super ghostly, creepy trophies, which rattled as I strode, were but matters to which, or such to which, I had been accustomed to from my infancy. While I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar was all of this, I still wondered to find how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirring up. So as a kid, I played here all the time. And I didn't really notice the whole place was like dark and black and had black floors and like creepy trophies and like weird pictures. But now that I'm older, and maybe it's because I creeped myself out, I'm looking at this stuff and I'm like, this place is kind of creepy. I never noticed it before, but it's kind of like if you had walked into the Addams Family house. That's kind of what it is. On one of the staircases, I met the physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. All right, so you see where it says low cunning and perplexity? That is a paradox. If someone is of low cunning, that means that they're not very smart, okay? If they are perplexed, it means that they're smart enough to know to question something, okay? So this guy looks, simultaneously, he looks stupid and smart at the same time. And again, Edgar Allan Poe does this to make you uncomfortable because he's trying to throw your understanding of reality away from you. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and so vast a distance from the black oaken door as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through the trellised panes and served to render sufficiently distinct more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceilings. So basically, I walked in, the windows were all red, it was really dim and dark in there, and it was hard to see anything. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow, an air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from the sofa on which he had been lying at full length and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it. I at first thought of an overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of the ennui, a man of the world. So basically, he greeted me at first, and it seemed to be an act, like he was so relieved. However, at his countenance, convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat, spoke not. I gazed upon him with a feeling of half pity, half of awe. Surely a man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverousness of complexion, he looks like a dead body. An eye, large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison. Lips, somewhat thin and very pallid, but of surpassingly beautiful curve. A nose of delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth and nostril unusual in similar formation. A finely molded chin, speaking in want of prominence, of want of moral energy. Hair of more than web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of his temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten. So he looks like a Tim Burton character. If you've ever seen Tim Burton characters with their big old eyes and their very pallid skin, think Jack Skellington, that's what this guy looks like, all right? He's not unattractive, he's just a little bit creepy. And now in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features and upon the expression they were wont to convey lay so much of the change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin and the now miraculous luster of the eye above all things startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, as in its wild gossamer texture it floated rather than fell about the face. I could not, even with effort, connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with the incoherence and inconsistency I soon found to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome a habitual trepidancy, an excess nervous agitation. So he's like, I wanted to be nice to the guy, but he was still kind of freaking me out the way that he was like way over the top in his happiness to see me. He seems manic. If you've ever seen someone who is a manic, frantic person, that's the way Roderick Usher is acting. For reminiscences of a certain boyish traits, and by the conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament, his action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision when the animal spirits seemed utterly in abeyance to that of a species of energetic concision, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, hollow-sounding enunciation, that leaden, self-balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance which may be observed in the lost drunkard or the irreclaimable eater of opium during the periods of his most intense excitement. So he acted like a drunk person. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered, at some length, into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil, and one for which he despaired to find remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and general manner of the narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could hardly wear only garments of a certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments which did not inspire him with horror. So basically, he's been so worked up that everything has to be bland. Food has to be bland, clothing has to be bland and very, very soft. Musical instruments have to be very, very quiet. Even the light itself seems to bother him. So he's very sort of vampire-like. All right, he's very sort of drawn and withdrawn from the world. To an anomalous species of terror, I found him a bounden slave. I shall perish, said he. I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon the intolerable agitation of the soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger except in this absolute effect, in terror, in this unnerved, in this pitiable condition. I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantasm, fear. So he is afraid that fear itself is what's going to kill him. Not a monster, not a sister, not this weird ghostly mist that's around his house, not the moss that seems to be eating the house or the house itself. He is afraid that his own terror is what is going to kill him. Okay, that he is going to work himself into such a frenzy that something bad, maybe his heart stops, maybe he has an aneurysm, whatever it is, that fear itself is what's going to kill him. Okay, all right, so I'm going to stop there. My in-class people, if you will come up and grab a little wipey wipe and wipe down your area.